23 title. Baby discovered a bear. Cub stuck in a subway turnstile. What baby did next stopped the city. The morning arrived in the city with a whisper rather than its usual roar. Ethan Marshall shifted his 18-month-old daughter Lily on his hip as they descended the subway stairs at Grand Central Station. The early hour meant fewer people, fewer sounds, just the distant rumble of trains beneath their feet and the soft echo of their footsteps against concrete walls. Lily's small fingers wrapped around his collar, her bright eyes taking in everything with that particular wonder only toddlers possess. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long shadows that danced as they moved deeper into the station. Something felt different this morning, though Ethan couldn't quite place what it was. The air carried an unusual stillness, as if the city itself was holding its breath. They reached the turnstile area, where normally a steady stream of commuters would be pushing through, but today only a handful of early risers stood frozen in place, their phones lowered, their mouths slightly open. Ethan followed their collective gaze and stopped so suddenly that Lily made a small sound of surprise against his shoulder. There, wedged impossibly in the middle turnstile, was a bear cub. Not a large one, perhaps 3 months old at most, with fur the color of chocolate milk and eyes that held more fear than ferocity. Its small body was stuck halfway through the metal bars, one paw reaching forward while the others scrambled for purchase on the smooth floor. The cub made soft whimpering sounds that echoed in the tiled space, sounds that seemed to pull at something deep in everyone's chest. Ethan's first instinct was to step back, to protect Lily, but his daughter had other ideas. She wiggled in his arms, pointing with one chubby finger and making excited babbling sounds. The people around them remained motionless, as if movement might shatter whatever strange spell had fallen over the station. A businessman in an expensive suit stood with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. A jogger had paused mid-stretch. Even the station attendant behind the bulletproof glass seemed frozen, phone receiver dangling from her hand. The cub's eyes found Lily, and something extraordinary happened. The fear in those dark eyes softened, replaced by what could only be described as curiosity. Lily responded by reaching out both arms, the universal toddler gesture for "I want." Ethan knew he should move away, should call someone, should do anything but stand there. Yet his feet remained planted. The morning light filtering down from the street level caught the dust motes in the air, making them dance like tiny stars around the unlikely scene. More people began to gather, but they moved slowly, quietly, as if approaching something sacred. No one screamed, no one ran. They simply stood in expanding circles around the turnstile, witnesses to something they couldn't quite name. The cub tried again to push through, its small body trembling with effort, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the growing crowd. Lily made a sound then, not quite a word, but something gentle and soothing, the kind of noise she made when petting their neighbor's cat. The cub stopped struggling and looked directly at her. In that moment, the entire station seemed to pause. The distant rumble of trains faded. The humming of lights became a whisper. Even the city above them, with all its endless motion, seemed to slow. Ethan found himself moving forward, not away, drawn by something he couldn't explain. He knelt down, bringing Lily closer to the cub's eye level but still maintaining what he hoped was a safe distance. The bear cub's nose twitched, taking in their scent, and then it did something no one expected. It relaxed. Its small body stopped trembling, and it rested its head on the metal bar, eyes never leaving Lily's face. A woman nearby whispered to her companion, her voice carrying in the unusual quiet. She said she had lived in the city for 40 years and had never seen anything like this. Her companion nodded, unable to look away from the scene unfolding before them. Someone started recording with their phone, but they did it quietly, respectfully, as if documenting a miracle rather than capturing content. The video would later show what everyone there felt but couldn't quite articulate. A moment of pure connection between two innocent beings who didn't know they were supposed to be afraid of each other. Lily continued making her soft sounds, and the cub responded with small huffs that almost sounded like contentment. The space between them crackled with something electric yet peaceful, dangerous yet beautiful. The station attendant finally found her voice and made a call, but even her words were hushed, careful not to disturb the moment. She explained the situation to whoever was on the other end, and Ethan could hear the disbelief in the responding voice even from several feet away. More people arrived, drawn by messages and social media posts that were already beginning to spread. But instead of the chaos such a situation would normally create, each new arrival seemed to absorb the atmosphere immediately, joining the quiet congregation. An elderly man with a cane stood next to a teenager with purple hair. A mother with 3 children lined up beside a construction worker still in his hard hat. All of them watched as Lily and the cub continued their wordless conversation. Time moved differently in those moments. Minutes felt like hours, yet also passed in heartbeats. The cub occasionally shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position, and each movement brought a soft murmur from the crowd. Someone offered to help, suggesting they could oil the turnstile bars, but others quietly discouraged any interference. This was something that needed to unfold on its own terms. Lily never lost interest, never became frightened, never did any of the things a toddler might be expected to do when faced with a wild animal. Instead, she seemed to understand something the adults around her were only beginning to grasp. This wasn't just about a stuck bear cub. This was about something larger, something that touched the part of humanity that still remembered what it was like to live alongside nature rather than apart from it. The morning commute that should have been starting began to back up. People at other stations wondered why trains were being delayed, but down in that underground space, no one cared about schedules or meetings or any of the usual urgent business of city life. They were witnessing something that would stay with them long after the moment passed. A businessman loosened his tie. A nurse coming off her night shift sat down on the floor, not caring about her scrubs getting dirty. Children who would normally be rushed along by hurried parents were allowed to stand and stare, their young faces reflecting the same wonder that Lily displayed. The bear cub, for its part, seemed to accept its situation with a grace that belied its predicament. It stopped struggling entirely, content to rest and observe the strange creatures observing it. Ethan's arm was getting tired from holding Lily, but he didn't dare move. He could feel his daughter's heartbeat against his chest, steady and calm, so different from his own racing pulse. He thought about all the warnings he'd heard about wildlife in the city, about the danger and the diseases and the importance of maintaining distance. Yet here was his baby girl, completely unafraid, teaching a station full of adults something about trust and connection. The cub's breathing had slowed to match Lily's, or perhaps it was the other way around. They seemed to exist in their own bubble of understanding, 2 young souls recognizing something in each other that transcended species. The fluorescent lights that usually felt harsh and unforgiving now seemed to cast everything in a soft, almost dreamlike glow. Someone in the crowd mentioned that they should really call animal control, that this couldn't go on forever. But even as they said it, their voice lacked conviction. No one wanted this to end. No one wanted to return to the regular world where bears and babies didn't share quiet moments in subway stations. The city above them continued its relentless pace, unaware that below ground, In a space usually reserved for hurried transitions, time had slowed to honey. Every breath was deliberate. Every heartbeat was felt. The bear cub's eyes began to droop, as if the gentle attention from Lily was lulling it toward sleep. Several people in the crowd found themselves yawning in response, caught in the contagious calm that had settled over everyone. A child, somewhere in the back, asked their parent why the bear was there, how it had gotten into the subway. The parent didn't have an answer, and that uncertainty, rather than being frightening, felt appropriate. Some things didn't need immediate explanation. Some mysteries were better left to unfold slowly. The question rippled through the crowd, though, each person wondering the same thing. Where had this cub come from? Where was its mother? How had it navigated the city streets and descended into the subway system? The questions multiplied, but no one voiced them loudly. They hung in the air like morning mist, present but not oppressive. Lily made another sound, this time clearly trying to form a word. It sounded like friend, though Ethan couldn't be sure. The cub's ears perked up at the sound, and its tail, what little of it was visible, gave a small wag. The moment stretched and stretched, elastic and infinite. People who had been standing for 20 minutes didn't feel tired. Those who had important places to be found, those places suddenly less important. The bear cub and the baby had created a bubble of peace in one of the busiest cities in the world, and everyone present understood, without discussing it, that they were witnessing something precious. The usual urban anxieties fell away. The constant pressure to move, to achieve, to hurry simply evaporated. In its place was something older, something that hummed in their bones and whispered in their blood. It was the recognition of life meeting life, of consciousness acknowledging consciousness across the vast divide of species. Ethan noticed that Lily's eyes were beginning to droop too. The excitement and wonder were giving way to the drowsiness that always claimed her around this time of morning. He shifted her slightly, and she rested her head on his shoulder but kept her eyes on the cub. The cub, as if sensing the change, gave a small sigh that seemed to echo through the station. The crowd had grown to nearly 100 people now, all maintaining that same respectful quiet. Phones were out, recording and photographing, but even the electronic sounds were muted. The usual ping and buzz of notifications had been silenced, as if the devices themselves understood the sanctity of the moment. It was then that they heard the footsteps. Different from the soft shuffle of arriving onlookers, these were purposeful, professional. The crowd parted slowly, reluctantly, to reveal a woman in the uniform of animal control. But instead of the rush and efficiency one might expect, she moved with the same careful reverence as everyone else. Her face, when she saw the scene before her, shifted from professional assessment to something softer. She stood for a long moment, taking in the baby and the cub, the crowd and the quiet, before slowly setting down her equipment bag. Her name tag read Savannah Reed, and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen many interactions between humans and animals, but perhaps none quite like this. Savannah didn't immediately reach for her tools or try to take charge of the situation. Instead, she knelt down a few feet from Ethan and Lily, observing the cub with practiced eyes. She noticed things others had missed: the slight favoring of one paw, the particular pattern in its fur, a small mark behind its ear that looked almost like a tattoo but couldn't possibly be. Her brow furrowed slightly, but she said nothing, not wanting to disturb the spell that had been cast. Lily noticed her and gave a small wave, the kind she gave to everyone, and Savannah found herself waving back, a smile tugging at her lips despite the unusual circumstances. The cub's eyes tracked the movement, alert but not alarmed. The question of how to free the cub without frightening it or endangering anyone hung in the air, but Savannah seemed in no rush to answer it. She pulled out her phone and made a quiet call, speaking in hushed tones that the crowd strained to hear. She mentioned the location, the situation, but also something else, something about checking records and unusual reports from the night before. When she hung up, she looked at the crowd and then at Ethan. She told him his daughter had a gift, that animals could sense gentleness, and Lily clearly had it in abundance. Ethan felt a swell of pride and something else, a kind of recognition that his daughter was special in ways he was only beginning to understand. The story of what was happening in the subway began to spread beyond the station. Social media posts with hashtags like Subway Bear Cub and Baby and Bear began trending. News vans started arriving at street level, but the reporters found themselves speaking in hushed tones when they descended the stairs, infected by the atmosphere below. The city that never slept was taking a collective breath, pausing in its relentless forward motion to focus on this single, impossible moment. Office workers watched feeds on their computers. Students paused in their classes to check updates. Parents showed their children the videos, and those children asked if they could go see the bear too. But down in the station, the focus remained on the immediate. The cub, the baby, and the growing understanding that this was more than just an unusual incident. Savannah had been examining the turnstile, trying to figure out how to extract the cub without using force. The mechanism was old, the kind that hadn't been updated in decades, and the cub had managed to wedge itself in a way that seemed to defy physics. She could use lubricant, she explained quietly to those nearest, but that might frighten the cub. She could call for the turnstile to be dismantled, but that would take time and tools and noise. Or they could wait, see if the cub could free itself once it calmed down completely. The crowd seemed to collectively choose the third option without discussion. Lily had begun to hum, a tuneless little melody she often sang to herself before naps. The cub's ears swiveled to catch the sound, and incredibly its eyes began to close. The entire station held its breath as the small bear actually began to doze, right there in the turnstile, lulled by a toddler's lullaby. Ethan felt tears prick his eyes and saw he wasn't alone. The construction worker was wiping his face with the back of his hand. The elderly man with the cane was openly weeping. There was something so pure, so unexpected about this moment that it bypassed all their carefully constructed defenses and went straight to their hearts. Savannah used the opportunity to examine the cub more closely, though she was careful not to touch it. That mark behind its ear was definitely unusual, almost like a small tattoo of a star. She'd seen many bear cubs in her career, both in the wild and in the city, but never one marked like this. She took photos, sent them to colleagues, and waited for responses. Meanwhile, the crowd continued to grow, but also to organize itself. People began sitting in concentric circles around the turnstile, creating an amphitheater of humanity with the cub and Lily at its center. Someone started passing around coffee from a nearby cart, the vendor refusing payment. Someone else distributed pastries. It became an impromptu gathering, a celebration of something none of them could quite name. The morning wore on, and still the cub dozed, and still Lily watched, fighting her own need for sleep. Ethan's phone buzzed with messages from his wife, Jessica, who was watching the news from home with a mixture of disbelief and concern. He tried to explain through texts what it felt like to be there, but words failed him. How could he describe the way the air itself felt different? How could he explain that their daughter seemed to be communicating with a wild animal through nothing more than presence and patience? He gave up trying and simply sent a photo. Lily's small hand reaching toward the cub, not touching, just reaching. and the cub's paw extended in the same way, the space between them crackling with possibility. The response from Savannah's colleagues came back, and her expression changed from puzzlement to amazement. She stood slowly and addressed the crowd, her voice carrying despite its softness. She said the mark on the cub wasn't a tattoo but a natural marking, one that had been documented in only a handful of bears worldwide. These bears, she explained, were part of a conservation program so secret that even most wildlife officials didn't know about it. The program involved creating safe spaces for urban wildlife, places where animals could thrive without human interference, but also without danger to humans. The crowd leaned in, hungry for more information, but Savannah seemed hesitant to continue, as if she'd already said too much. It was then that the cub stirred. Its eyes opened slowly, finding Lily immediately, and something passed between them that made everyone present hold their breath again. The cub began to move, not struggling but shifting, and incredibly, impossibly, it began to slide backward through the turnstile. It was as if the metal bars had suddenly become flexible, or the cub had become liquid. Within moments, it was free, sitting on its haunches on the station floor, no longer trapped, but also making no move to run. The crowd gasped collectively, then fell silent again. Lily clapped her hands, delighted, and the cub tilted its head at the sound. Savannah moved slowly, carefully, pulling something from her bag. It wasn't a net or a cage, but a simple collar, one that looked more like a ribbon than a restraint. She explained that she wasn't going to capture the cub, but simply mark it for tracking, to ensure its safety as they figured out where it had come from. The cub watched her approach with those intelligent eyes, but didn't flee. When she was close enough, Lily reached out and touched the cub's head, just for a moment, just the briefest contact of skin and fur. The station seemed to vibrate with the significance of that touch. Then Savannah slipped the collar around the cub's neck, and it was done. But the story was far from over. Savannah's phone rang again, and this time her expression went from amazement to something approaching awe. She listened, nodded, and then looked up at the crowd with eyes that sparkled with unshed tears. She said she had just learned where the cub had come from, and if people wanted to know, if they wanted to be part of something extraordinary, they should follow her. Not everyone could come, she said, looking apologetically at the crowd. But Ethan and Lily, they were invited specially. The cub had chosen them, in a way, and they deserved to see this through to the end. The crowd parted as Savannah led the way, the cub following her as if it had known her all its life. Ethan carried Lily, who was now fully awake again, energized by the adventure. They climbed the stairs to street level, where the morning sun was now fully up, painting the city in gold and shadows. The news crews tried to follow, but Savannah led them down side streets and through alleys, losing the media in the maze of the city. Soon, it was just the four of them. Savannah, Ethan, Lily, and the cub, making their way through a city that suddenly seemed full of hidden possibilities. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the cub padding along beside them as if this was the most natural thing in the world. People they passed did double takes but didn't interfere, perhaps sensing that this was something beyond ordinary understanding. Finally, Savannah stopped in front of an old building, one of those pre-war structures that the city was full of, but that most people walked past without seeing. She produced a key from her pocket and opened a door that Ethan would have sworn wasn't there a moment before. Inside was an elevator, the old-fashioned kind with a gate that had to be pulled closed manually. Savannah ushered them in, the cub entering last, and pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator rose slowly, creaking and groaning, but Lily wasn't afraid. She was watching the cub, and the cub was watching her. And Ethan felt like he was in a dream. Savannah explained as they rose that the building was one of several in the city that had been secretly converted. Their rooftops transformed into something unprecedented. She said that some people in the city government, people who understood that urban wildlife was increasing and needed somewhere to go, had created these spaces. They were kept secret to prevent interference, to allow the animals to live without becoming tourist attractions. But sometimes, like now, an animal ventured out, and the secret was in danger of being exposed. The elevator stopped, and Savannah pulled open the gate. They stepped out into a small hallway with a single door at the end. She opened it, and Ethan gasped. They were on the rooftop, but it wasn't like any rooftop he'd ever seen. It had been transformed into a forest. There were trees, actual trees, growing in soil that must have been brought up somehow. There were bushes and flowers and a small stream that ran in a circle, powered by some hidden pump. And there, in the center of this impossible garden, was a full-grown bear, watching them with eyes that were exactly like the cub's. The cub made a sound, something between a whimper and a roar, and bounded forward. The mother bear rose to meet it, and they collided in a tangle of fur and obvious joy. Lily laughed, a sound of pure delight that echoed across the rooftop. The mother bear looked at them, at these humans who had brought her baby back, and Ethan could have sworn he saw gratitude in those wild eyes. Savannah explained that the mother had been brought here pregnant, rescued from a situation upstate where she would have been killed. The rooftop had become her home, and she had given birth here, raising her cub in this secret garden in the sky. But last night, the cub had somehow found a way out, probably through a maintenance door that had been left open by mistake. It had wandered the city, eventually ending up in the subway, drawn perhaps by the warmth or the sounds. The mother had been frantic, Savannah said, pacing the rooftop all night, but there had been no way to track the cub until it had been found. Now, reunited, they were both safe. The rooftop was one of 12 in the city, she revealed, each hosting different animals, all part of this secret conservation effort. It was an experiment in coexistence, in finding ways for nature and civilization to overlap without conflict. Ethan set Lily down, and she toddled toward the bears, fearless as always. The mother bear watched her approach but made no aggressive moves. Instead, she lay down, allowing the cub to climb on her back, and both of them watched as Lily came closer. She stopped just out of reach, seeming to understand that this was different from the subway, that here the bears were home and she was the visitor. She waved, the same small wave she'd given Savannah earlier, and incredibly, the mother bear lifted one massive paw in what could only be interpreted as a wave back. The moment was so surreal, so impossible, that Ethan wondered if he was dreaming. They stayed on the rooftop for another hour, watching the bears play, watching Lily explore the garden with wonder in every step. Savannah told them more about the program, about how it had started with just one rooftop and one family of raccoons, and had grown to include bears, foxes, even a family of deer on a particularly large building in Queens. The city was secretly wild, she said, in ways most people never imagined. The animals were tagged and monitored, their health checked regularly, but otherwise they were left alone to live as naturally as possible given the circumstances. It was beautiful and strange and somehow perfect. As the sun climbed higher, Savannah said they should go, that the bears needed time to resettle, and the secret needed to be kept. She asked Ethan not to reveal the location, to let the story remain about the subway encounter and not about what came after. He agreed, understanding that some magic needed protection from too much scrutiny. As they left, Lily turned back one more time, and the cub stood on its hind legs as if saying goodbye. She blew it a kiss, a gesture Jessica had taught her, and the cub dropped back to all fours and disappeared into the foliage with its mother. The elevator ride down was quiet, each of them processing what they'd witnessed. When they emerged onto the street, the city seemed different to Ethan. Every building potentially held secrets. Every rooftop might be a hidden wilderness. The noise and rush that usually felt overwhelming now seemed like just one layer of a much more complex urban symphony. Savannah walked them to the subway entrance, the same one where everything had started. The turnstile had been fixed, she noted with a smile, and the crowds had dispersed. Life had returned to its normal pace, but Ethan knew that everyone who had been there that morning would carry the memory forever. Before she left, Savannah knelt down to Lily's level and thanked her. She said that Lily had reminded everyone that fear was learned, not born, and that connection was possible across any divide if approached with an open heart. She gave Lily a small pin, a star that matched the mark on the cub's ear, and told her to keep it as a reminder that the city was full of wonders. Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like she had never been there at all. Ethan looked down at his daughter, who was examining the pin with serious concentration, and realized that this morning had changed them both in ways he was only beginning to understand. The journey home was surreal. The subway car was full of people reading about the morning's events on their phones, watching videos of Lily and the cub, discussing theories about where the bear had come from and where it had gone. Ethan wanted to tell them the truth, to share the miracle of the rooftop forest, but he kept his promise to Savannah. Instead, he held Lily close and listened to the conversations around them. People were saying the city had needed this, had needed something pure and unexpected to remind them that life was more than commutes and deadlines. They were right, Ethan thought, but they didn't know the half of it. Jessica was waiting for them at home, having watched everything on the news. She swept Lily into her arms, checking her over for injuries that weren't there, and then pulled Ethan into the embrace too. They stood there in their doorway, a family reunited after an adventure that seemed too strange to be real. Jessica had 1,000 questions, but Lily was already yawning, the excitement finally catching up with her. They put her down for a nap, the star pin clutched in her small fist, and then Ethan told Jessica everything, the parts that hadn't made the news, the secrets he'd promised to keep but couldn't keep from his wife. That evening, as they watched Lily sleep, Jessica said something that would stay with Ethan forever. She said that maybe the city hadn't really stopped because of what Lily did. Maybe it had stopped to remember what it was like to be amazed, to be part of something bigger than individual lives and personal problems. The bear cub had been a catalyst, but the real magic had been in how people responded, how they'd chosen wonder over fear, patience over panic. It was a choice, she said, that everyone could make every day but usually didn't, too caught up in the rush to notice the opportunities for connection and amazement that surrounded them. The news coverage continued for days. Experts debated how a bear cub could have gotten into the subway system. Animal rights activists used the incident to push for better urban wildlife policies. City officials promised investigations and new safety measures, but for those who had been there in the station, watching a baby and a bear cub share a moment of pure understanding, the official explanations felt hollow. They had witnessed something that couldn't be captured in reports or analyzed in segments. They had been part of a spontaneous communion that had revealed the city's hidden heart. Ethan returned to the building with the rooftop forest once, weeks later, just to see if he could find it again. But the door that Savannah had opened was gone, or perhaps had never been there for anyone but them. The building looked ordinary, unremarkable, just another piece of the city's architectural jumble. He stood there for a long time, looking up at the rooftop, imagining the bears living their secret lives above the unsuspecting city. It was comforting somehow, knowing they were there, knowing that wildness persisted in the most unexpected places. Lily never forgot that morning. As she grew older, she would tell the story to anyone who would listen, though most assumed she was embellishing or misremembering. She kept the star pin on her backpack through elementary school, on her jacket through middle school, and on her keychain as an adult. She studied veterinary medicine, surprising no one who knew her story, and specialized in urban wildlife. Years later, when she had children of her own, she would take them to that same subway station and tell them about the morning a bear cub got stuck in a turnstile, and the whole city remembered how to stop and wonder. The videos from that morning became legendary online, resurfacing every few years with new commentary and analysis. People pointed out details others had missed. The way the crowd had naturally formed a circle, the way the light had seemed different in the station, the way even the electronics had seemed to quiet themselves. Some called it a miracle, others called it a beautiful coincidence. But for those who had been there, it was simpler than that. It had been a moment when the barriers between human and animal, between city and nature, between stranger and stranger, had dissolved, revealing the connection that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Savannah continued her work with the secret rooftop sanctuaries, occasionally sending Ethan updates through channels he never quite understood. The bear cub grew strong and healthy, she reported, and had cubs of its own eventually. The program expanded carefully, thoughtfully, always maintaining its secrecy while providing havens for creatures that would otherwise have nowhere to go. She said that Lily's interaction with the cub had inspired new protocols, gentler approaches to wildlife management that recognized the possibility of coexistence rather than just control. The city itself seemed different after that morning, though it was hard to say exactly how. Perhaps people were a little more patient with delays, understanding that sometimes stopping was as important as going. Perhaps they looked up more often, wondering what might be living on the rooftops above them. Perhaps they were more likely to pause when they saw something unusual, to approach with curiosity rather than fear. Or, perhaps, it was just that those who had been there carried a secret knowledge that they shared through glances and small smiles when they recognized each other on the street. Ethan never told most people about the rooftop, keeping his promise to Savannah. But sometimes late at night when Lily couldn't sleep, he would tell her about the secret gardens in the sky, about the animals living their wild lives just above the city's consciousness. She would fall asleep imagining forests where buildings should be, streams where there should be concrete, and always, always, a small bear cub with a star-shaped mark, waving goodbye to a little girl who had shown a city how to stop. The story became part of the city's mythology, told and retold, embellished and simplified, but always carrying the same core truth, that one morning, in the most unexpected place, innocence had met innocence, and the whole city had paused to witness it. The subway turnstile was eventually replaced, but there was a small plaque installed nearby, so small most people missed it. It simply said, "On this spot, wonder happened." And for those who knew, who had been there, who had felt the city stop and breathe, that was enough. Years passed, and the city continued its relentless pace, but the memory of that morning lived on. In the way parents were a little more patient with their children's fascination with animals. In the way commuters sometimes paused to help rather than hurry past. In the way the city's wildlife seemed a little less afraid, a little more visible, as if they too remembered the morning when a baby and a bear had shown everyone that connection was possible, that fear was optional, that wonder was always just a moment away if you were willing to stop and see it. The rooftop sanctuaries remained secret, but their influence spread. Other cities began their own programs, creating hidden havens for urban wildlife. Architects started designing buildings with secret spaces for animals. City planners began considering not just human needs, but the needs of all the creatures trying to survive in the urban landscape. It was a quiet revolution, one that happened in small increments and careful steps, but it all traced back to that morning in the subway, to a stuck bear cub and a fearless baby, and a crowd that chose to stop and witness rather than run away. Ethan often thought about the moment when Lily had touched the cub's head, that brief second of contact that had seemed to vibrate through everyone present. It had been such a small gesture, but it had carried such weight. It was trust made manifest, connection made physical, the bridging of a gap that most believed was unbridgeable. He thought about all the gaps in the world, between people, between species, between nations, and wondered what might happen if everyone approached them with the same fearless curiosity that Lily had shown that day. The mother bear and her cub lived on the rooftop for many years, joined occasionally by other bears who needed sanctuary. The garden grew more elaborate, maintained by a secret network of volunteers who understood the importance of what they were protecting. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, people in the apartments below could hear the bears moving above them. And instead of being frightened, they felt comforted, knowing they were part of something larger, something that proved the city was more than just concrete and glass. Lily grew up to become not just a veterinarian, but an advocate for urban wildlife, though she never revealed the full truth of what she had seen that day. She worked with city officials to create legal sanctuaries, public spaces where people and animals could coexist safely. She always wore the star pin. And when people asked about it, she would just smile and say it reminded her that magic existed in the most unexpected places. Her children, and later her grandchildren, would beg for the story of the bear in the subway, and she would tell it differently each time, but always with the same ending. The city stopped not because it had to, but because it wanted to. Because sometimes stopping is the most important thing you can do. The subway station where it all happened became an unofficial pilgrimage site for those who knew the story. People would pause at the turnstiles, remembering or imagining what it had been like. Parents would tell their children about the importance of being brave and kind, even when faced with something scary or unknown. The station attendants, who changed over the years, would sometimes find flowers left near the plaque, or drawings from children of bears and babies, and they would smile, understanding that this place held special meaning for many people.